So I have Matthew 12, verses 1 through 21. So I'll just read through, and then I'll get into what I have. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate of the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest." I have 2 waters. Thank you. But only for the priest. Or haven't you read in the law that the priest on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet are innocent? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. If you had known these words for what they mean, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," and you would have not condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Going on from that place, he went to the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against him, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you have a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But as the Pharisees saw this, they went and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. "Here's my servant whom I have chosen, the one whom I delight and whom I love. I will put my spirit on him, and I will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through victory. In his name, nations will put hope." So I want to start off here with who the Pharisees were. And I didn't know before who the Pharisees were, but I do now because I work, little did you guys know, I work at a worm farm. Yeah, I know. In California, worm farm means like weed farm, but I promise I'm not working at a weed farm. No, it's a worm farm, and if you want to, I'll explain it. No, I won't explain it. Abram will, wherever he is. He'll explain it all to you. He knows all about it. But I have a really smart guy there. His name's Dave. He told me all about the Pharisees. Talks more than my dad, which is insane. But the Pharisees, they are a legalistic sect of Jews that believe if they can uphold the Mosaic law, that they would be able to enter heaven. The funny part about this, they really sucked at upkeeping the Mosaic law. So since they couldn't do that, they probably weren't going to get into heaven. But the Pharisees hated Jesus because Jesus came down to earth because we could not keep what was spoken, the Mosaic law. We couldn't do that. So he had to sacrifice himself for us. But when Jesus came down, the Pharisees, I think, knew who Jesus kind of was and knew that this guy has power. He might be able to take something from us. The Pharisees were very power hungry, so they didn't like Jesus because of that. They followed Jesus around a lot, ironically, though, even though they were not followers of Jesus. In this passage, it says they saw him and then told him, what you are doing is unlawful on the Sabbath. And when I first looked at this, I thought, yeah, I guess it is unlawful to do this on the Sabbath because they're collecting grain on the Sabbath. The Sabbath day, you weren't supposed to work or collect grain. But then me and my mom pulled out this old other Bible book, study book or whatever. And if you go to, well, you don't have to, it's very short. But in Deuteronomy, where the law is, 24, verses 24 through 25, if you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hand, but you must not put a sickle to the standing grain. This entire system was called gleanings. Farmers were told in the Old Testament to not collect all of the grain that they had. So Bob, for example, he's a farmer. God would tell him, don't collect all your grain. That's what the law said. Don't go through twice, don't get all the grain. This was in order to keep poor people fed. This was how they would eat. And the disciples, I don't know this to be factual, but I don't think they're very rich. I don't think they had a lot of money to buy food with. And so they're going throughout the grain fields and on the Sabbath day, and they're getting food to eat. They're not harvesting this in order to make a profit. They're not doing anything else. It's not lawful not to eat on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to not, wait, how did I phrase that? Let me think about that for a second. I think I said it right. But yeah, you're allowed to eat on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to do work on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to carry heavy loads. You're not allowed to start a fire. You're not allowed to put out a fire. You're not allowed to do things like that. But it's actually condoned. You're supposed to have 3 big meals with your family on the Sabbath. At least that's how it is now. So I think what the disciples doing here is completely lawful. They're supposed to be eating food. They're probably very hungry. They've probably been traveling for days. But I'll move on to the next verse. He answered, "Having you read what David did when he and his company were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest." So Dan already went over this story in the 10:30 service, but I'll kind of give the short end of it. David, at this point in the story of 1 Samuel, is being hunted by Saul, and he flees to the city of Nob and goes to the tabernacle, and he finds Ahimelech the priest there. He then asks for any food that he may spare, but there is none, besides the sacred showbread that is put in the temple for God, and then only the priest of Aaron are able to eat that. Nobody else is supposed to. I thought about this one a lot, and I don't really know what to think of it. The only thing that I kind of came up with is, that God values people more than the law. David, at this point in the story, he's had it pretty rough. He's been hunted by Saul. He's been almost killed a couple times now, and he's also just said goodbye to his best friend, and in the previous chapter right before that in 1 Samuel, and he's probably not had very much food to eat in maybe a couple days, who knows. But God sees that David's going through this, and God provides for him, and David goes to the temple and he gives him the showbread, and I think God pardoned him of that, even though he was not supposed to do it by law. Verse 5, "Or haven't you read the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet are innocent? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." People of the time believed that the temple was incredibly important. It's where you would go to meet God. You would go sacrifice. You would go just be in communication with God and see priests and everything. That's how important it was to them. Even on the Sabbath day, they allowed people to work on it. And by law, they're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath, but yet they're pardoned of it. And like I said before, the temple was intended to be a place to be with God. But Jesus has come down from heaven, and his entire goal is to give everybody, in my mind, a piece of the temple, give everybody the Holy Spirit so we all can be in communication with God. And then I have here, why does God allow people to desecrate the Sabbath? Well, I think that, like I said before with David, that this is more important. People meeting God, people coming to God is more important than the law. It's the point of the Sabbath was so you could be with God. And I don't think if on the Sabbath day, 6 days a week, God says, yeah, you may come to me, sacrifice to me, and be with me. But on the seventh day, no, you shouldn't, because it's the Sabbath. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So, verse 7, "If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." This is an Old Testament book. It's from, this I desire mercy, not sacrifice. It's from Hosea 6:6, and it just says the same thing. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And I think this kind of funny here. Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, have you not read this? Like, if only you know what these mean. And the Pharisees, they were supposed to be people who read the Torah and the Nevi'im all the time. But they still didn't know what that meant. The Pharisees, knowing the word, should have known to show mercy to the disciples. In the very beginning, when the Pharisees told the disciples, what you're doing is unlawful, instead of condemning them and kind of making fun of them, they should have shown mercy on them. They should have saw that they were hungry and on the Sabbath day, and instead brought them in and fed them. But instead, they decided to condemn them. The Pharisees often ignore the spirit of the law, the actual intent behind the law, and instead take it and just make it a bunch of rules and regulations. That's what they did with the Sabbath. The Sabbath, like I said earlier, was meant to be with God, but instead they followed Jesus around on the Sabbath day, which I find kind of ironic. Me and Brett talked about that. He said it was kind of ironic that you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath at all, but yet the Pharisees, instead of talking with God and being with God, they're following around Jesus and trying to condemn him for what he's doing. I moved on to the next one without moving on to the next one. Going on from that place, he went to their synagogues. A man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Here the Pharisees are trying to put Jesus in a trap. If he says, no, it is not lawful to heal on the Sabbath, he will be going back on what he said when he pardoned David and with the showbread and when he excused the priest for performing work on the Sabbath. That's what will happen if he says no. But if he says yes, then the Pharisees are just going to discredit him and say, this man's an idiot. He says you're supposed to do work on the Sabbath. But Jesus was smart and knew their intentions the entire time. So instead of answering their question with a yes or no, he answered it with another question, which is the next verse. He said to them, "If any of you have a sheep and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." This is a pretty obvious verse. Jesus is saying it's good to do good things on the Sabbath. But I have here, me and Brett also talked about this one. He said he likes to think that one of the Pharisees actually did have this happen to them, or something of that sort. Sheep actually did fall in a pit on the Sabbath, and then he thought, oh, I've got to get my sheep out. Those are pretty valuable. And so that just kind of shows how twisted the Pharisees were. They they didn't value people as much as they valued the sheep, money almost. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Jesus heals on the Sabbath, I probably think, all the time. In the next verse, it says he healed a great multitude of people. And if the Sabbath was so important, you're not supposed to heal people, he would have just not healed them and healed them the next day. The guy with the withered hand, he probably would have lived. I don't know. I didn't know what he was inflicted with at the time, but he probably would have lived. And the next day, if it was that important, he would have healed him. But instead, he took mercy. He had mercy on him and healed him that day. So I think another instance of people being more important than religious law. And it says, but the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. This one just is kind of crazy to me. They see an incredible miracle, a person with a withered hand, and it's completely restored. It's just as good as the other one, they say. And their first response to that is, yeah, we got to kill this guy. It's just kind of dumb. But yeah, it just shows how far gone the Pharisees were and how much they desired their power. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, the one whom I love and whom I delight in. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. This here was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah, chapter 42, verses 1 through 4. Jesus is just saying that he is the Messiah. The Pharisees should have seen this and known that what he was talking about. This was in the Nevi'im, which I think I'm saying that right, and the Nevi'im was a book where it was just about all the prophets and stuff. And so the Pharisees had access to this. But here is the verses in Isaiah chapter 42, 1 through 4. It's just the same thing. They parallel each other. Here's my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one whom I delight in. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout out or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teachings the islands will put their hope. I almost just spat out my water. That would have been bad. These verses are the same thing, which proves that Jesus is the Messiah. He's fulfilling these Old Testament prophecies, and now, he's just saying that he's Messiah. And I don't know why I did this. I put this in the middle of the other two, which I don't know why I did it, but I did it. It's okay. But verse 19, he will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the street. People expected at this time, people didn't only expect, actually, they wanted a king like David or Saul. They wanted a almost warrior-like king to come and destroy the Romans, to just dethrone them and set up a new kingdom. But Jesus was the complete opposite of that. I'll explain all of their characters. David, people admired him because he killed Goliath. He killed the guy nobody else wanted to kill. He led their armies in battles and killed thousands of Philistines. People admire Saul because of his strength in battle and his ability to inspire others, and he defended Israel pretty well. But Jesus was the complete opposite of them. Instead of being a warmongering king sent to destroy others, he came down as this lowly servant who washed people's feet. Verse 20, a bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. I believe when he's talking about the bruised reed, he's referencing a fragile or hurt person, that he's going to deal with them gently and not harshly. And the smoldering wick, that he will not snuff out any faith that we have. I think that's what the wick represents. Any little faith that we have, instead of trying to snuff it out and just putting it under, he will make a situation for it to grow, and with any little faith we have. And that is all I have. I went through it very fast again, but I'll just pray. God, thank you for this opportunity to just grow. And I thank you for all these people here that are just after you, God. And I pray that you just set a fire inside of us, and that you would just pour out your grace and mercy, and that we take it, and that we just grow in you, God, and that we desire to learn more about you. I pray these things in your name. Amen.